Hello again everyone, and welcome back. My name is Esero, and in this video, I'll be covering my take on the absurdly powerful Pyroclast Mine Saboteur. Pyroclast Mine was fully reworked in 3.8 and received numerous changes to its functionality and DPS capabilities. When detonated, it now triggers a small explosion at its location before sending multiple projectiles into the air that cascade down, dealing additional area of effect based damage. This mine deals a high amount of base fire damage and adds additional fire damage to hits against enemies that our mines are near, stacking with each nearby mine. And on top of that, Pyroclast Mine will be firing an additional projectile for every 2 prior mines in the detonation sequence. With all of these stacking modifiers, we are heavily incentivized to keep as many mines out as possible and create massive chain detonations. This makes the Tremor Rod military staff just about the perfect weapon to combine with Pyroclast mines. It allows our mines that we've just detonated to rearm themselves, ready to be detonated for a second time, keeping our active mine count high and helping us to create cataclysmic chain detonations, stacking upon itself until it becomes a server-bending singularity that is capable of dealing ungodly amounts of single-target damage. When executed properly, you'll be able to instantly phase or just completely annihilate just about every single boss, often decimating fully juiced high-tier metamorphs and Elder Slayers alike in under 1 second, and even manages to phase through endgame bosses like Shaper and Sirus in only a couple of seconds. For me personally, this is the most single-target damage that I've ever experienced in a build. Oftentimes, incredible single target does not come with incredible clear speed, and normally Pyroclast Mine would not be the exception to that rule. However, this league, a new ring was introduced, the Astral Projector Topaz Ring. At its core, it's quite the strong ring, but it has one key stat that we need: Nova spells cast at the targeted location instead of around you. Despite the wording, it does function with Pyroclast Mine. This causes both the initial explosion and resounding projectiles to directly trigger at the location of enemies nearby our mines, essentially making our Pyroclast mines auto-targeting. This makes them drastically easier to use and speeds up mapping considerably, automatically spreading their destructive area of effect based damage to all nearby enemies, devastating entire packs, and sometimes triggering screen-wide explosions. With auto-targeting, respawning, and chaining Pyroclast mines, sending out hundreds of projectiles and explosions, often making this build feel less like a mine-based Saboteur and more like a versatile Pyromancer. Defensively, the build is solid, but is not going to win any awards. When optimized, it can push well over 8,000 energy shield, with quite a bit of regeneration, fast recovery rate, and a Vol discipline to keep us going. We also have a cast when damage taken, a Mortal Call, complete immunity to stun, and high chaos resistance, a fair amount of block chance, and the ability to blind, hinder, and chill just about everything we come up against, making our enemies drastically slower and much less likely to hit us. All of these defensive layers combining to make us relatively durable, and I suffered very few deaths on my way through the endgame, completing deathless 2 full sets of Elder Slayers, 2 full sets of Guardians, a Shaper fight, and 2 Sirus fights. The build can face some occasional deaths when it gets one-shot or quickly bursted down by powerful content that mostly occurs in chaotic mapping situations. The majority of these situations can be avoided by simply using the range of your mines to your advantage. Boss fights will often not prove to be very dangerous, as the bosses typically only have a second or 2 to live, and if they somehow survive your initial barrage, they are often left extremely weak and can be quickly finished off at your leisure. And finally, that brings us to expense. This time around, getting the base of the build going and performing well is only going to be of moderate cost. There are some required moderately priced uniques and several pieces of rare energy shield based gear that will often be at least moderately expensive to pick up. But many of our key pieces of gear that would normally drive the price up are exceptionally cheap here. Our main weapon, the Tremor Rod, can often cost below 1 chaos unlinked, our main helmet enchantment is not required for the build, and our body armor only needs to be 4 linked. And furthermore, Pyroclast Mine is so strong that even on a 5 link you can do some insane work. But to reach the levels seen in the video, you'll need to be spending a fair amount of currency, a sacrifice that in my opinion is well worth it. I've never piloted a build that was more powerful than this one, and it is incredibly easy to recommend. It has a smooth, easy to learn playstyle, and rains death and destruction on all the high tier maps and endgame bosses you can imagine. This build guide uses the free external program Path of Building to summarize and display its information at a glance. I've included multiple skill trees and gear sets for different stages of your character's development, which you can change just like this. So without further ado, let's get right into just how to make this build happen Let's begin by taking a quick overview look at our endgame skill tree. Our main offensive focuses are going to be on scaling the following: building up as much fire, spell, and mine damage as possible, and increasing our critical strike chance and multiplier, as well as some elemental resistance penetration. Finally, we'll be looking to increase the amount of mines we can have active, their detonation speed, and our throwing speed as well. We'll only be picking up one offensively focused notable, which is going to be Pain Attunement, which grants us 30% more spell damage when we're on low life. We will be constantly reserving the majority of our life pool, meaning that this notable will always be active, granting our Pyroclast mines a substantial DPS boost. Defensively, we'll be focusing on the following: heavily increasing our amount of energy shield, our energy shield recharge rate, and picking up some elemental resistances as well. We'll also be utilizing the Keystone Zealot's Oath, which converts all of our life regeneration, including what we get from the Ascendancy Pyromaniac, into pure energy shield regeneration. We'll also be utilizing some utility in this build, with our main focuses being the following. We'll be heavily reducing the amount of mana we reserve with our auras, as well as reducing the amount of mana that our mines reserve when thrown, and picking up several convenient jewel sockets around the skill tree, which can be used flexibly depending on what your version of the build needs the most. And with that, we've covered the primary pathing of the skill tree and discussed what the build wants to focus on most. From here, I'd like to move into our Ascendancy, the powerful Saboteur. We'll begin by discussing the previously mentioned Pyromaniac. It grants us complete immunity to Ignite and Shock, and allows us to regenerate 1% of our energy shield per second for each mine that we've detonated recently, up to a maximum of 10%. It also heavily reduces the amount of mana that our mines reserve when thrown, a fantastic defensive and utility focused node that is really nice to have in the build. Next up is going to be the node Bomb Specialist, which increases our area of effect for each active mine. It also provides us with a decent boost to our mine throwing speed and damage if we've detonated mines recently, and causes our mines to detonate much faster, heavily increasing our potential DPS. Moving along now to our third node, which is going to be Demolition Specialist. This causes our mines to hinder enemies near them for 2 seconds when they land, reducing our enemy's movement speed by 40%. This node also provides 100% increased effect of auras from mines. But what does this mean exactly? With the arrival of 3.8, mines saw a drastic rebalance. All mine skills were given an aura component that is active while they are placed but not detonated. These individual auras stack together up to a specific limit and are affected by aura modifiers. In the case of Pyroclast Mine, this aura is the modifier we've discussed previously, each mine adding additional fire damage to hits against enemies near it up to a specific maximum. So essentially, what Demolition Specialist does is double the amount of added fire damage that Pyroclast Mine adds for each mine near a specific enemy, with the end result being substantially increased DPS when we have a lot of mines active around a single target. At most, we can have 23 mines active at once, making this single Ascendancy node one of the most potent increases to our single target capabilities. From there, we move on to our final Ascendancy node, which is Born in the Shadows. This node gives us complete immunity to blind, and automatically blinds all nearby enemies, as well as giving us a 25% chance to blind distant enemies on hit. Any enemy affected by blind will be drastically less likely to hit us, giving our chance to evade a much needed boost. On top of that, blinded enemies will be dealing reduced damage to us, and taking increased damage from our hits as well. All 4 of these Ascendancy nodes are extremely good for the build. We basically have 2 different camps: the offensive camp of Bomb Specialist and Demolition Specialist, and the defensive camp of Pyromaniac and Born in the Shadows. When picking up your Ascendancies, there is no right or wrong order here. To some extent, you have to decide whether you want to focus on building defense or offense first. Due to the raw inherent power of Pyroclast mines, I'm inclined to recommend going with Pyromaniac and Born in the Shadows first, before picking up Bomb Specialist and Demolition Specialist later on. This is merely a recommendation, and you can go about picking up these Ascendancies in whatever order you'd like. Now let's forge onward into the Pantheon selection for the build. Beginning with the Major God, my top recommendation is going to be Soul of Solaris for its damage mitigation and reduction capabilities. You will of course want to be capturing all of the additional souls in order to get maximum value out of our Pantheon. With Solaris operating at full capacity, it can give us some serious burst protection by giving us immunity to critical strike damage if we've taken a critical strike recently. Furthermore, it reduces the damage that we take from a variety of sources and gives us the chance to occasionally avoid ailments entirely. Pressing ahead now to the Minor God. There's a lot of flexibility here, so switch this up if you'd like, but my top recommendation will be to pick up Soul of Shikari. Be sure to capture the additional soul as well. When Soul of Shikari is operating at full capacity, you'll be taking inherently reduced chaos damage and have complete immunity to poison, an incredibly nice bonus for the build, and one less thing for us to worry about. Next up is going to be our Bandit selection for the build. And as per usual, we only have two real options here: Alira or kill all of the bandits. We can make good use of every single passive point we can get our hands on, making the two passive points quite the alluring option. If you can comfortably get your elemental resistances sorted out, I would recommend going for the passive points. However, especially early on, you may really want to take full advantage of the critical strike multiplier, mana regen, and resistances that Alira provides. Thus, my top recommendation is to pick up Alira early on and stick with it for as long as you need to, only replacing it if you can get all of your resistances figured out. With that covered, it's time for us to move into the skills and links that power the build. We'll begin first and foremost with Pyroclast Mine itself, which will be a 6-link composed of these gems. You'll want to be socketing this directly into your Tremor Rod military staff to gain the benefit of the +2 to level of socketed spell gems. Pyroclast Mine is the only gem in this setup that will have its levels increased, but it gains massive benefit from doing so, heavily increasing its base damage and the amount of added fire damage to our hits for each active mine near an enemy. Each level of Pyroclast Mine matters heavily, so picking up a level 21 version is going to be a high priority when optimizing the build. For our first link, we have Minefield, which substantially lowers our mine throwing speed, but gives us the ability to throw 5 mines at once, and increases the maximum amount of mines that we can have active at one time by an additional 4. As a result, you can stack up to 23 mines very quickly, and with a single click, you can throw enough mines to feel comfortable detonating them immediately, giving you enough power in one throw to get some decent chain detonations going. Trap and mine damage, elemental focus, and concentrated effect all cause our mines to deal more damage. Each one comes with its own individual downside. Trap and mine damage reduces our mine throwing speed a little bit. Elemental focus prevents us from inflicting elemental ailments with Pyroclast Mine itself. This isn't really an issue, as we'll be running the aura skitter bots, which will automatically chill and shock nearby enemies for us. And concentrated effect lowers our area of effect pretty significantly, but once again, this really isn't a downside for the build. With so many explosions and so much AoE, you really won't notice too much of a difference. Even when we want to be clearing, Astral Projector takes care of that for us. It doesn't really matter if the explosions are slightly smaller if they're being automatically placed in the perfect spot, landing directly on our enemy's location. And finally, that brings us to our 6th link, the SRO staple, Inspiration Support. It provides us with a huge reduction to the mana reservation of each mine, and with every inspiration charge we stack up to a total of 5, it will increase our critical strike chance and elemental damage substantially. A really solid gem to cap off our powerful 6th link for Pyroclast Mine. This was the exact setup that I ran for every boss fight seen in the footage. It offered way more than enough damage, and no swaps are directly recommended for any situation. Moving swiftly on to our next setup, which is going to be Armageddon Brand, in a 4-link composed of these gems. Armageddon Brand can be placed and will attach to nearby enemies, occasionally activating, dealing large amounts of fire damage in an area around it, cursing them with flammability, lowering their fire resistance by up to 45%. Armageddon Brand is also likely to inflict Ignite, and because we have it linked to combustion support, any enemies ignited by Armageddon Brand will have their fire resistance lowered by up to another 20%. This setup is almost 100% for boss encounters directly. It is not even remotely necessary to use during mapping. We have plenty enough damage to deal with any sort of enemy we come across there. But against any sort of boss, placing this near them and allowing it to attach to them will provide us with a monstrous increase to our DPS. This is especially good against any boss that spawns in or plays an animation before the fight begins. With that covered, let's move into our next setup, our movement skill, which will be a 2-link composed of Flame Dash at level 20 or 21 and Arcane Surge at level 6. Flame Dash allows us to quickly dodge, pass through doors, and cross gaps with ease. We have it linked to a low-level Arcane Surge in order to guarantee that it procs its buff every time we use Flame Dash. The buff Arcane Surge grants us more spell damage, increasing the potency of our Pyroclast mines, and grants us some mana regeneration as well. Due to our frequent use of Flame Dash, you will consistently have this buff up during mapping, and with careful timing you can also gain this damage bonus during boss fights as well. Next on the agenda is going to be the first of 2 aura setups. Summon Skitterbots is a strange aura. It summons both a chilling and a shocking Skitterbot, which run around doing just that, chilling and shocking nearby enemies. They will also occasionally detonate our mines. However, much like Tremor Rod, these mines will be rearmed and can be detonated again. Skitterbots also grants us 10% more mine damage as well. Herald of Ash at high levels simply grants us 12% more spell fire damage, and is in the build simply to push more DPS. Discipline grants us a huge amount of flat energy shield and is crucial to have in the build. It also increases our energy shield recharge rate by 30%. Its manually activated Vol counterpart allows your energy shield to constantly recharge even in the face of incoming damage. Normally that energy shield recharge would be delayed if you got hit again. This basically provides the build with a panic button. If you take some serious damage and you need to recover now, you can pop Vol Discipline and it will allow you to recharge constantly. We deal so much single target DPS that I found myself often using Vol Discipline at the very start of a boss fight when triggering other skills. Using Vol Discipline both preventatively and in key moments can be the difference between life and death. We'll be connecting all 3 of these auras to an Enlighten at level 3 or level 4. Enlighten simply reducing the amount of mana that these 3 auras reserve. We'll also be reducing our mana reservation with nodes on the tree, like the Sovereignty cluster and the first node of the Influence cluster. These nodes will also impact our next setup, which will be our Blood auras, which will be another 4-link composed of these gems at these specific levels. We'll be linking all 3 of these auras to Blood magic, which causes all 3 of them to reserve life rather than mana, allowing us to cram in a total of 6 auras into the build, pushing our power levels to even greater heights. Zealotry grants us another 16% more spell damage and 40% increased spell critical strike chance, a very powerful offensively focused aura for the build. We'll also be running a Precision and a Clarity, both at level 1. We'll want to be keeping these at an exceedingly low level to make sure that we have enough life to actually have all of these auras active. Precision simply grants the build 40% increased critical strike chance, and Clarity grants us a very small amount of mana regeneration. If you have the life to spare later on, you can consider leveling this up a little bit to gain a bit more value out of it. Alternatively, you can swap out Clarity completely and run an additional level 3 or level 4 Enlighten. This will free up a bit more life, essentially adding to your effective life pool, but you won't be drawing on it very often. Regardless, we'll be linking all 3 of the gems you select to Blood Magic at as high level as possible. Blood Magic has an extremely high mana multiplier. As a result, the more you level up Blood Magic, the less life will be reserved overall. And with that said, we've covered all 6 of our auras, and it's time to move into our last setup. This will be our Cast to Win Damage Taken in a 3-link composed of these gems at these specific levels. We want Cast to Win Damage Taken to be at a low level so that it procs often. Any gems connected to Cast to Win Damage Taken that have a required level equivalent to or lower than Cast to Win Damage Taken itself will be automatically triggered once a certain damage threshold is reached. We'll be automatically triggering a level 3 Immortal Call, causing us to take less elemental and physical damage for a short duration, and a level 7 Wave of Conviction that will deal mostly fire damage, and as a result, it will lower the fire resistance of any enemy it hits by another 25%, providing another huge damage boost against affected enemies. That leaves us with 1 socket left in this item, which will be Vol Righteous Fire. We will never be activating the regular Righteous Fire, we'll only be using the Vol counterpart. This is one more item to be activated right before a boss fight begins. It will sacrifice a chunk of your energy shield and life, which will be quickly recovered. For 4 seconds, we will gain 28% more spell damage, an absolutely massive DPS increase. Learning when to time this will ensure a very swift victory, and is the perfect way to cap off all of our skill gems. Before we move on to our gear selections, I want to break down and discuss my basic strategy for using Pyroclast Mines effectively against bosses and while mapping. We'll begin first with boss fights. While a boss or metamorph is playing its animation or spawning in, you'll want to be doing a few different things to set up and begin doing DPS the moment they are susceptible. Ideally, about 3 or 4 seconds before they spawn in, I would start throwing mines, trying to get up to your maximum total of 23 at least a second or 2 before the boss has actually arrived. Then about 1 second before the boss becomes active, you want to activate your mines with a single press of your detonation key. Don't throw any mines for at least a brief moment. You'll want to take this opportunity right before the boss is completely susceptible to cast Armageddon Brand, Vol Righteous Fire, and Vol Discipline, before instantly going to trigger your 3 offensively focused flasks. Following that, you may also want to hit your Enduring Eternal Mana Flask a few times to guarantee that you have mana for the next 10 to 15 seconds of the fight. I personally have my detonate key set to spacebar, and my Vol Discipline, Armageddon Brand, and Vol Righteous Fire set to F1, F2, and F3 respectively. with my 3 offensively focused flasks located directly below at 2, 3, and 4, making it very easy to hit the keys that I need and get everything active in a very short amount of time. Detonating those mines a second early gives them the opportunity to start building up huge amounts of additional projectiles. Thus, the instant the boss is actually able to be hurt, your Pyroclast mines are already a devastating singularity of death that will instantly consume the boss's entire health bar. When trying to manage a huge chain detonation, it can be beneficial to not spam the detonate button during that time. Ideally, you just want to detonate once and continue to chuck in mines to fuel the fire. This is not something that I perfected, and I had a bad habit of wanting to hit the detonate button multiple times. It did not seem to actually affect my DPS, and I was able to keep some ridiculously good chains going even when hitting detonate multiple times. To be on the safe side, try to avoid doing that directly, as it may or may not actually break the chain and cause you to reduce your damage significantly. But your job isn't done yet, and you have a couple of different choices on how to handle those first and probably only couple seconds of the fight. If you feel that the boss doesn't really pose a huge threat to your character, you'll want to begin chucking in additional mines after you've let that chain detonation get started. Typically, waiting around half a second to a second is going to be enough time, but getting that timing down is something that you'll have to practice yourself. Doing this can heavily extend the duration of this chain detonation. It will increase your DPS pretty heavily, but requires you to stand still. If you're facing a boss that you know can deal some serious damage up front, I would let the chain detonation do its thing and simply walk away. This is a great opportunity to use Flame Dash and trigger Arcane Surge, giving you another nice damage boost. The chain detonations are often enough by themselves and don't really require you to throw additional mines in, but if you want to really be melting the boss, stand your ground and throw more mines into the fray after a short delay. With this strategy down, you'll be facing or completely decimating every boss in the game within just a few moments, sometimes even less. While this strategy is very specific, the mapping strategy is not so much. With even just a few mines down, we deal tons of damage, and with Astral Projector and our recasting mines from Tremor Rod, most of this is just taken care of for you. It's important to note that when using Tremor Rod, rearmed mines cannot be detonated again until the initial novas stop casting. This doesn't mean that we can't get insane chains going, it just means that they happen a little bit slower. When throwing 5 mines and detonating just that group of 5 will typically result in a detonation of around 6 to 7 mines, only managing to detonate 1 or 2 of the rearmed mines, leaving the rest for you to detonate at your leisure. However, even just having 10 mines out can provide enough time for all of the rearmed mines to be detonated again, though this will prove to be somewhat inconsistent and highly depends on the location of the mines when detonated. This continues to scale as you would expect, becoming slightly more likely to detonate all of the mines the longer the chain goes on. While generally mapping, feel free to hit the detonate button just about as many times as you want. Mines can be detonated almost instantly now, dealing with enemies before they have a chance to deal with you. Just remember to slow down and watch your use of the detonate button when you're trying to get a huge chain detonation going. You can be fairly aggressive during an average mapping situation, but if you start to become hesitant or if the map is especially dangerous, I would advise keeping a little bit of distance in between you and the nearest pack, dealing your damage from a medium distance, keeping your character safe, and letting the mines do the work for you. Finally, become comfortable with utilizing Vaal Discipline in bad situations. If you take at least 60% of your life total and you have Vaal Discipline available, there's no reason not to use it. With the basic functionality and playstyle of the build covered, let's briefly discuss the best way to level the build, and what types of skill gems and gear to utilize. When leveling this build, we will not be going Energy Shield until much later in the process. For all of the acts up until the endgame, this will be mostly a life-based build, with a little bit of Energy Shield mixed in. Later on, once you picked up the majority of your endgame gear, or at least your first iteration of it, you can switch into our mostly Energy Shield setup, and reserve your life for extra auras like Discipline. When making this switch, you'll want to transition out of those life-based nodes and into a version of the endgame skill tree. Remember that multiple trees are included in the path of building for the different stages of this leveling process. From here, let's move into discussing the skill gems that you want to utilize when developing this character. We'll begin first with our active skill gem. I recommend just leveling this as a mine-based build from the start. You can begin by using Stormblast Mine, which you'll receive almost immediately, up until level 12, at which time I recommend switching into Icicle Mine. Icicle Mine has amazing clear speed and can be used for as long as you'd like. At level 28, Pyroclast Mine will finally become available to you, and can very comfortably be used from that point onward through the entire endgame. You can delay switching into it for as long as you'd like, or switch right away. It's really up to you. For auras, I heavily recommend running Zealotry, Clarity, and possibly Precision, and if you can spare the mana, run a Herald or summon Skitterbots. You want to also be getting a Flame Dash with Arcane Surge set up as soon as possible, and a single target focused Armageddon brand like the one previously discussed will serve you very well against bosses. As the gems become available, you can also consider getting the cast when damage taken setup going, and having Vol Righteous Fire will only make your boss fights even easier. Moving on now to the leveling gear, beginning with the weapons. From level 1 onward, you can dual wield 2 Life Sprig wands. These are very cheap and provide the build with plenty of additional spell damage and some life and mana as well. You should be able to run these with very little issue all the way up until level 41, at which time you can equip the Tremor Rod, which is currently dirt cheap and available for less than 1 chaos unlinked. From there, you can either just keep using your Tabula Rasa or whatever chest piece you have, or you can combine the exceptionally cheap Tremor Rod that you just picked up with the Jeweler's Touch Prophecy, which is also available for quite cheap. For a single Jeweler's Orb, it will turn your Tremor Rod into a 5-link, which you can use for the remainder of the leveling process, before eventually working on your 6-link down the road. From there, many of the other usual suspects will serve the build very well. All of these items are very cheap and come highly recommended for a smoother leveling experience. If this is your first character ever, or first character of the league, don't stress out about getting all of these items. If you have some Alchemy or Chaos Orbs drop during your leveling experience, feel free to pick up some of the cheaper options available here. Regardless, during the leveling experience, you want to be using a Diamond Flask, 1 or even maybe 2 Quicksilver Flasks, and potentially something like a Jade or Granite Flask for added defense, or something like a Wise Oak if you wanted to push a little bit more damage. Now that we've discussed the leveling experience and general strategy, it's time for us to move into the endgame gear selection. In Path of Exile, the cost of an item is determined completely by supply and demand. With a player-driven economy, prices may shift following the release of this video or in future leagues. As a result, direct listed prices will become inaccurate almost immediately following the video's release. In lieu of that, I use price tiers to describe the cost of an item, with those tiers being cheap, 0 to 20 chaos, moderate, 21 to 100 chaos, and expensive, anything over 100 chaos in price. Occasionally, you will also see flexibly priced items that can be tailored to fit your budget. With that disclaimer out of the way, let's get started with our endgame weapon selection, the exceedingly cheap and powerful Tremor Rod Military Staff. In the previous 2 sections, we discussed Tremor Rod heavily. We'll only be taking a broad overview look at it here. Tremor Rod provides the build with a decent amount of block chance, some increased spell damage, and heavily increases the level of our Pyroclast Mine, boosting our damage significantly. Due to the fact that Pyroclast Mine is already a mine, it cannot be supported by Blast Chain Mine, which in this case essentially does nothing at all. The main benefit of Tremor Rod is the previously discussed rearming of mines, allowing us to achieve much greater chain explosions. Forging onward from there to our helmet selection, which is going to be a flexibly priced rare helmet with a high energy shield base. Our primary focuses will be stacking as much energy shield, elemental and chaos resistance, and as many needed attributes as possible. The helmet you pick out is going to be somewhat dependent on our helmet enchantment. This time around, we're going to be looking for the enchantment Pyroclast Mine fires 1 or 2 additional projectiles. Now I want to make this very clear, this enchantment is not required. We'll be running Dying Sun, and due to Pyroclast Mine's own nature, tons of additional projectiles will be spawned during the chain detonations. The build will still perform extremely well without it. As proof, here's footage of me taking down a high tier, fully juiced Metamorph with no helmet whatsoever. With that discussed, let's move on to our main body armor selection, which is going to be Chevron's Wrappings, Occultist Vestment. These are available unlinked for cheap, 5-linked for moderate expense, and fully 6-linked for an expensive cost. However, in this case, that's not a huge concern to us. The way I have the path of building set up, we're only going to need this to be a 4-link. We'd ideally want it to have all 6 sockets, so we can make use of every gem possible, but it does not need to be fully linked. A 6-socket, 4-link, and separate 2-link will be more than enough, and is extremely easy to achieve in comparison to having a full 6-link. Thus, your primary focus should be getting a cheap Chevron's Wrappings. Bring it up to 20% quality with some Armorer scraps, and then just throw some Jewelers at it until it becomes a 6-socket. Getting a 4-link from there should be a relatively simple process. When buying one, your primary concern should be getting as high of a percentage roll on increased energy shield as possible. This body armor provides us with a large amount of energy shield, some lightning resistance, and a faster start to our energy shield recharge. But we're using it specifically because it grants us the opportunity to use our blood auras. The single line, chaos damage does not bypass energy shield, allows us to run an unbelievably small life pool that hides behind a much bigger energy shield. The armor itself has very little offensive power, but its ability to grant us additional auras is very powerful indeed, and as a result is essentially required for the build to shift into Energy Shield and run its endgame auras. Now let's delve a little bit deeper and discuss the glove selection for the build. Our top pick will be another flexibly priced rare with a good Energy Shield base. Our primary focuses will be stacking as much Energy Shield, Elemental and Chaos resistance, and as many needed attributes as possible. Marching forward now into the boots, we'll be looking for a flexibly priced rare pair of boots with a high Energy Shield base, with our focus being on getting as much Energy Shield, Elemental and Chaos resistance, and needed attributes as possible, with an additional focus of getting at least 25% increased movement speed. This is not required but will make the build feel a lot smoother. When looking to enchant these boots, any of these options will serve the build well, so if you're enchanting a boot yourself and land on one of these, you can feel pretty happy about it. With that said, let's take a look at our amulet. This time around, it's going to be a Presence of Chayula Onyx Amulet. For just a moderate price, it heavily increases our chaos resistance, prevents us from being stunned by anything, and converts 20% of our maximum life into Energy Shield. It is our absolute best in slot option and should be picked up as soon as possible. Be sure to pick up an uncorrupted version so that you will be free to anoint it with something powerful. Here are some of the best available options. For cheap, you can pick up Efficient Explosives, which will grant you increased mine damage and heavily reduce the amount of mana that your mines reserve. For a moderate price, you can pick up Counterweight, which will heavily increase your critical strike chance and multiplier. Again, for a moderate cost, you can pick up Cleansed Thoughts, which will double your chaos resistance. Please keep in mind that Presence of Chayula only brings your chaos resistance up to 0%. Doubling that will net you literally nothing. However, with its Series Promise active, you will get 35% increased chaos resistance, which will be doubled up to 70%, nearly capping it, but only when that flask is up. Only pick up this defensive anointment if you're looking to max out your chaos resistance without flasks. You want to at least be getting 38% chaos res on your gear so that it can be doubled and hit the cap of 75%. And finally, that brings us to our ultimate anointment, the expensive, but well worth it, Tranquility. It increases our maximum Energy Shield by 5% and grants us Transfiguration of Soul, which causes our increases to maximum Energy Shield to apply to spell damage at 30% of their value, and this will result in drastically increased DPS, making this, in my opinion, the best possible anointment for the build, and certainly the most powerful. With those options covered, I'd like to move into the rings of the build, and we'll begin first with the previously discussed Astral Projector Topaz Ring. Currently available for quite cheap, it will boost your lightning resistance, intelligence, spell damage, and even give you a decent chance to avoid elemental ailments. It also makes our Pyroclast mines auto-targeting, causing them to spawn at the location of nearby enemies rather than directly at the mine itself, making it much easier for you to hit bosses and packs, improving your clear speed significantly in all situations, and almost single-handedly turns Pyroclast mines from being slightly clunky into a very enjoyable and satisfying pseudo-spellcasting experience. For our second slot, we have two primary options. First up will be the offensively focused choice, the Circle of Anguish Ruby Ring. It will have a huge variety of implicits and will also have two different Herald of Ash related modifiers. As a result, certain combinations are very powerful. I have two different recommendations. The one I went with was utilizing the Herald of Ash increased buff effect and the huge amount of added fire resistance as well. If you get a decently rolled version of this combination, you can count on shoring up around 80 to 90% of your fire resistance on one piece of gear, which allows you to have a much easier time capping out your cold and lightning resistance using your other gear slots. Alternatively, if you're able to get your resistances squared away and you have plenty of money, you can pick up the expensive combination of the Herald of Ash increased buff effect and the increased fire damage. This will be fairly pricey to pick up, but is one of the most powerful single options for the build, and will certainly serve you well if you can afford it. The core modifiers should of course be much more of a main focus, but if you can find some good implicits, go for it. A completely alternative option here will be to utilize a flexibly priced rare ring. If you choose to go this route, it should be for one specific reason: to make the rest of your experience gearing out the build a lot easier, by using the slot to get an absolute ton of elemental resistances, ideally over 140%. This will make your experience picking up the other pieces of rare gear a lot smoother. They won't need to have nearly as many resistances, and you can spend that focus getting higher Energy Shield, more attributes, and other helpful stats that the build needs. This is not my top recommendation, but is extremely good defensively and makes gearing a lot easier for those on a tighter budget. Soldiering on now to one of our final pieces of core gear, the belt. We'll be utilizing a flexibly priced rare crystal belt. Our primary focus will be getting as much energy shield, strength, and elemental resistances as possible. With a high energy shield roll and a high energy shield implicit, this is an incredible candidate for use with the Tempering Catalyst. This can prove to be somewhat expensive to full equality, but is well worth it for the additional flat energy shield. There are plenty of good secondary focuses to be looking for as well, so pick up the best belt that you can afford. And with that, the majority of the rare gear is completely wrapped up, and it's time for us to discuss the flasks of the build. First on the list is going to be a cheap Quicksilver flask. The prefix is flexible and totally up to you, but the suffix should either be of heat, of staunching, or of warding, with my top recommendation being of warding. Being able to press just one button and start running faster and get rid of temporal chains or any other annoying curse makes it very easy to keep up and helps to improve the mapping experience. Next up is going to be the moderately priced Dying Sun Ruby Flask. This flask will improve your fire resistance, cause you to take less fire damage, slightly increases your area of effect, and most notably, causes Pyroclast Mines to fire 2 additional projectiles, further improving both our clear speed and our single target damage. In our third slot, we have the cheaply priced and incredibly powerful Diamond Flask. The prefix is once again very flexible, but you'll want to get a suffix of either warding, staunching, or heat, with my top recommendation being of staunching. This provides you with immunity to bleeding during the flask effect and removes all bleeding on use. The Diamond Flask makes your critical strike chance lucky, essentially allowing the game to roll twice to see if you've crit and taking the best result, giving you a substantial boost to your effective critical strike chance during the flask effect, resulting in heavily increased damage against all targets. For our fourth flask, we're going to be utilizing the cheap It Series Promise. It gives us a nice increase to our chaos resistance, and gives us a big chunk of extra chaos damage that scales off of our elemental damage. In our fifth slot, we have our Enduring Mana Flask. The prefix here is not flexible and needs to be of enduring, ensuring that the flask effect does not end when we reach full mana. This gives you the ability to queue up multiple uses, and the flask will activate automatically again and again, giving you a constant flow of mana while mapping. You will want this to have a suffix of warding, of staunching, or of heat. You'll want to cover all 3 of those bases with 1 on your Quicksilver Flask, 1 on your Diamond Flask, and 1 on your Mana Flask. My top recommendation for the Mana Flask is to get of heat, removing both freeze and chill on use, and making you immune to both during the flask effect. There are also a few good alternative options that can be mixed in for either the Dying Sun or the It Series Promise. A cheap Rumi's Concoction will provide the build with a lot of block chance and a huge amount of armor, a truly solid defensive flask. You could also consider for very cheap getting a Wise Oak Flask. This will be powerful both offensively and defensively, but you'll want to make sure that your uncapped resistances are completely balanced so that you gain the maximum benefit. And finally, for those with a huge budget, you can pick up the very expensive Bottled Faith. This flask is ridiculously powerful both offensively and defensively, and should be picked up if you have the money. And that brings us to our very last section of gear, the jewels. Let's begin with our single example of the Energy from Within Cobalt Jewel. Available for fairly cheap, this jewel inherently increases our maximum energy shield a little bit and causes increases and reductions to life in the jewel's radius to be transformed to apply to energy shield instead. We'll be placing this in the jewel socket right below Pain Attunement. In this location, it will change all of the maximum life that would normally be granted by melding into pure energy shield. Next on the list is going to be the optional but quite powerful Watcher's Eye. These jewels roll a randomized set of modifiers that are dependent upon the auras that the build is running. The price of an individual jewel will vary highly and can often become quite expensive for premium modifiers or examples of jewels that have multiple modifiers from the same aura. We are running a heap of different auras. All of the listed modifiers will be helpful to the build in different capacities. If you look to pick one up, try to find an example that fits your budget and has as many relevant modifiers as possible. And finally, that brings us to our very last item, flexibly priced Cobalt Jewels, with a primary focus on the following modifiers: percentage increased energy shield, an irrelevant critical strike multiplier, increased spell, fire, or mine damage, increased elemental resistances, and increased mine throwing speed. All of these modifiers will serve the build well in different ways, making these jewels quite flexible, so simply consider what you need most in the build and go in that direction. And I believe that brings us to our conclusion. With no exaggeration, this is the strongest build that I have ever played. It utterly humiliates just about every boss in the game, and that's in 3.9, following significant buffs to almost every boss's life pool. And if that wasn't enough, the newly introduced Astral Projector really does make this build a fun mapper, and a powerful one at that. Pyroclast Mine Saboteur can really do it all, and on a fairly reasonable budget for its performance. I've never felt more confident recommending a build, even for people people who don't typically like mines. All of the new items, improvements, and overhauls have made this an absolute blast to play, and I hope you'll give it a try. A huge thank you goes to all of my patrons for their continued support of the channel. It's truly appreciated and helps make this content possible. Special recognition goes to the following for their dedicated support of the channel: Anlei Huang Bao, Aro Briggs, Andrew Miller, Andy, Bloody, Chris Sherrick, Christopher Cravey, Christopher Murdoch, Daniel, Daniel Wigg, Darren Clark, David Lackamy, Efren Valladares, Eric Meyer, Gareth Thomas, Greg Wells, Jacob Davey, Ken Butler, Bodemus Prime, Ray Hill, Richard Bollinger, Stefan RCH, and Zolaris. Thank you, everyone. If you'd like to be credited at the end of each of my videos, or join our Discord server for channel and Path of Exile discussion, consider checking out the Patreon link in the description below. Finally, if you managed to make it this far, thank you so much for watching. I hope the video proved both entertaining and helpful. If you have any questions, leave them down below and I'll do my best to answer. Consider subbing to the channel for more build guides just like this. And as always, I've been Esero, and I will see you guys in the next video.